All right, thank you so much. This is an amazing turnout at 5:15. I don't know who's in charge, but 5:15 is pretty late in the day for me. I'm usually getting ready for bed at this hour. So I'm so grateful for all of you. But for me, this is a real highlight because receiving communities, sending zones, receiving zones, this is some of my favorite topically and thematically. This is what I get very excited about. So thank you everybody online, but thank you all of you all who are braving it here in the late afternoon. We're going to move quick because we're a few minutes over. We had a delay with slides. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, our speakers as they come up. But we're going to start with Rennie Jones, graduate student at, are you graduated now? You're done? All right, Yale School of the Environment, who's going to start it off for the day. So thank you for joining us, Rennie.
Thank you, Jesse, and thank you to the organizers. I'm delighted to be here and excited to be in conversation with you all. My name is Rennie Jones. I was a graduate student at Yale School of the Environment, but I've also been an urban planner and climate adaptation planner for about a decade, working in New York City, South Carolina, Houston, and outside of the country as well. So, do we have? I'm going to try to advance the slides, but I don't know how this works. So, nice. Okay, so as I'm sure you all know, climate change is now a leading cause of migration and displacement. In 2024, climate disasters displaced 45.8 million people globally, including 11 million displacements in the United States. This number includes preemptive evacuations, so it's something to consider, but also extended periods of displacement. Climate change is most often a compounding factor in migration decisions and combines with other vulnerabilities such as political instability, food insecurity, and poverty. Most people displaced by climate impacts remain in their own countries, but climate change is also increasing cross-border migration. And I'm going to talk a little bit about legal frameworks here for a second, because I do think they're related. So under the 1951 Refugee Convention, an asylum seeker cannot be returned to a country where they have a well-founded fear of persecution based on 5 grounds. And those are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of a particular social group. But because the convention does not explicitly list climate, there's no legal basis for the term climate refugee. But in the United States, asylum, temporary protected status, humanitarian parole have been used to carve out limited protections for some affected by climate disasters. And that's typically when they do intersect with other vulnerabilities that make the case for those 5 grounds. The US is an important location to establish legal and planning frameworks for climate migration. And in this case, I'm talking about cross-border migration, but also internal migration. It's the single largest historic emitter of greenhouse gases, and as of 2024, it was the largest recipient of new individual asylum applications in the world, by quite a margin. Cross-border climate migration is layered on top of growing internal migration caused by climate impacts. Cool. So the United States has responded to increasing cross-border migration with pushback policies. These were enacted under the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations, and they allow the US to refuse asylum seekers without considering their claims, even if valid. Pushback policies have an outsized effect on areas of Latin America that are particularly vulnerable to climate change, even though they were not necessarily designed to respond to climate-driven migration. And this includes Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. These nations rank among the lowest in GDP in Latin America and are heavily dependent on small landholder agriculture. So from the period of 2021 to 2024, these 3 countries accounted for nearly a quarter of all apprehensions at the US border. And Bermeo et al. Found that increases in agricultural stress due to drought in Honduras and Guatemala specifically strongly correlated with increases in apprehensions of family units from the same localities. So at the local scale, the town scale, those affected by drought in those areas showed higher apprehensions of family units at the US border. Now I know the Trump administration currently is revoking temporary protected status and is carrying out deportations, often without due process, even for many with legal status in the United States. So that does make the challenge even more challenging. While immigration and disaster response policies are established at the federal level, cities manage the day-to-day realities of climate migration. The majority of migrants move to cities, including 60% of those moving cross borders and 80% of those moving internally. Local governments are typically responsible for providing services for new arrivals and ensuring housing, education, and healthcare, all while promoting social cohesion. Unless cities have a plan in place to extend services to new arrivals, they may find existing problems intensified. And we saw that in New York City, which was a particularly acute example. Between early 2022 and late 2024, some 230,000 migrants arrived in New York City, compounding an existing housing affordability crisis. And again, this is not, especially people who were displaced by climate disasters, but speaking about migration, cross-border migration generally here. So at its peak in January 2024, nearly 70,000 migrants were staying in homeless shelters in New York City, and including 15,000 families, and that was on top of the 55,000 city residents already housed in shelters. The city paid an average of $400 per household per night over this period, which amounts to an inflated cost above the average cost of sheltering a household. So failing to anticipate migration is also a missed opportunity. The multifaceted challenges of the climate crisis offer a way to couple decarbonization and resilience with investments and services that benefit new and existing residents. I argue that with advanced planning and targeted investment, cities can reduce negative impacts for climate migrants, avoid future emergency costs, and realize co-benefits for existing residents. And this is not to suggest that building capacity for climate migration comes without a cost, or that climate migrants should be viewed as a capital opportunity. Rather, adequate advanced planning can lead to the greatest benefits for both climate migrants and cities alike. Despite funding challenges and the open hostility of the current administration to climate science and immigration, it's important we maintain a high level of ambition in planning. That's because climate change will continue to accelerate and drive displacement in the US and abroad. Migration is a form of adaptation, and as the global climate shifts, people will move to survive. Planning ahead is critical to build capacity and get systems up and running, and the public perception of migration in general has been a key issue in the rise of populist nationalism. Concerted capacity building in cities and smaller towns can help advance a counter-narrative, just as US cities continue to lead the way on climate policy, at least here in this country. And without being able to envision that the future that we want, we won't be able to build it. So, how do we plan for climate migration in cities? Beyond planning for growth in general, climate migration also requires distinct ways of planning ahead. That's because climate change is altering typical patterns of migration, displacing large numbers in very short periods of time, including, as we saw, more families. Many are uprooted from their communities and arrive with very few resources. As a result, climate migrants often require immediate support. Due to the lack of international legal frameworks and clear pathways for migration, cross-border climate migrants may be less likely to have advanced work authorization. Services such as legal assistance and job training are key. The needs of climate migrants may also differ based on climate drivers. Sudden onset events often result in temporary, short-distance movement unless damage is severe. Slow onset events may masquerade as slow economic growth and are more likely to drive permanent relocation. And in fact, the World Bank estimates that slow onset impacts alone may displace up to 216 million people by 2050. Finally, managing climate migration requires addressing climate change itself. And I want to make a point on this because in thinking about adaptation, we must also keep mitigation in the room. Because cutting emissions is critical, and investing in adaptation in vulnerable communities can mitigate future damage and displacement. Okay. So in addition to providing an option for climate vulnerable people to adapt to climate change, migration presents an occasion for growth and investment. Again, not without cost, and not seeing climate migrants as a capital opportunity, but as an approach that cities can take. Receiving communities can avoid future losses and realize benefits for existing and future residents in three primary ways: driving economic growth, catalyzing decarbonization, and supporting investments in climate resilience. I'll briefly note that there are several US cities already being touted as climate havens. My colleagues will get into this in more detail and with a much more nuanced approach, I'm sure. But these cities tend to have lower exposure to long-term climate impacts. But the conversation has largely centered, as far as I've seen, on kind of positioning these cities as real estate opportunities for wealthier residents that may be impacted by climate change in other cities and have the opportunity and resources to move. And I feel that that's a limited vision and could be expanded to include anyone that's affected by climate displacement. Cool. Okay, so climate migration can contribute to economic growth. Migrants consistently contribute more in taxes and economic activity than they use in public resources. That includes those without legal status. Migration tends to move labor to more productive regions and occupations. Migrants of all skill levels fill labor gaps in receiving communities, allow countries to expand their workforces, and offset the social security and pension burdens of aging populations. Employment is the single most important factor in determining economic impact, meaning programs and policies to support integration and facilitate access to jobs function as investments. And that can be over the longer term, but effectively positive economic benefit. So creating green jobs that are additional for the labor market will require significant investment and targeted policies, as well as specialized training. There are now fewer skilled laborers than needed to meet the demand for the installation of solar panels, wind farms, and heat pumps. Of course, this is also an issue that's being talked about for those that have barriers to accessing the job market already. So filling the labor gap will require tailored training that does not preempt those existing residents from accessing the programs. So over 125 cities and counties in the United States have adopted policies to electrify buildings, especially in the residential sector. In New York City, for instance, Local Law 154 requires new construction to be all electric for low-rise buildings and for taller buildings starting in 2027. Many cities in the United States are already experiencing severe shortages of affordable housing. To avoid catalyzing secondary displacement and climate gentrification, cities must protect and expand affordable housing in advance. Again, as we saw in New York City, sheltering large numbers of new arrivals at short notice can divert public funding to high emergency costs. With advanced planning, cities can couple investments in affordable housing with sustainability goals, hopefully creating green jobs in the process. Expanding sustainable transit options can also help decarbonize mobility, reduce commute times to expand employment options, and free up paved space for higher uses such as housing, parks, and other public goods. For smaller cities that have experienced population loss over time, new arrivals may allow for investments in mass transit or other infrastructure that doesn't pencil out at lower population densities. Cities also have the opportunity to consider climate migration in resilience and adaptation planning. This is my area of expertise. Displaced people with fewer resources tend to settle in city neighborhoods that already have higher exposure to climate risks. These areas may need upgrades to existing infrastructure or require pathways to adaptation or planned relocation. This could expose more people to future climate impacts, compounding the challenge and leading to higher losses down the line. Environmental disasters in the United States already disproportionately affect communities that have experienced strategic disinvestment, including Black and brown communities and those with low incomes and low educational attainment. The same populations are more likely to experience higher levels of climate gentrification as wealthier migrants move from areas with higher climate risk. Cities can identify which areas are most at risk and plan resilience in advance of population growth. This might entail reforesting degraded areas, conserving wetlands and park space, or increasing urban tree canopy, among many, many other options. In coastal areas, it could mean upgrading water supply and sewer systems to resist sea level rise and salinization. Cities can invest in resilience to ensure existing and future residents are able to weather climate disasters and avoid those higher costs down the line. And that is all I have, so thank you very much for your time.
That was amazingly timely.
Thank you. Sorry.
I'm impressed. Thank you very much, actually, for warming up our brains. Let's see, Hannah. Our next speaker is Hannah Teicher, am I saying? Teicher? Assistant Professor of Urban Planning, Graduate School of Design, Harvard. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here at the end of the day. So I'm really glad that Rennie brought up climate havens because this is what I want to talk about a little bit more today. So over the past few years, you may have noticed that a lot of the climate haven hype has converged on the Great Lakes region. We've seen story after story and map after map settle there. In 2020, a map showed how the habitable zone in North America would inexorably shift northward. In 2022, another map pulled out specific cities where Americans could escape climate change. And in 2024, yet another map highlighted a dense cluster of supposedly safe places in Michigan and Wisconsin. A few months ago, an architecture firm in Ohio seemed to take this for granted when they suggested that their services could dovetail with certain climate migration to the state. So the concept has clearly been mainstreamed into practice. You may have also noticed that within this region, Buffalo and Duluth have especially galvanized media hype. The attention to these particular places has a lot to do with political expediency and not that much to do with careful consideration of their capacity to serve as receiving communities. Journalists and researchers have challenged this narrative because every place will experience climate impacts, and most places are woefully underprepared. So, contributing to this, we wanted to apply a more systematic analysis to the challenge, asking, in imagined receiving regions, what places are currently receiving newcomers and what places have the capacity to be receiving communities. To answer the question about capacity, we built on a framework concerning effective receiving communities. In this framework, we position physical habitability as a necessary but insufficient precondition. Socioeconomic conditions are equally foundational. Adaptation capacity, both physical and social, and the ability to integrate newcomers are also crucial to serving as effective destinations for newcomers as the climate changes. To flesh this out theoretically, we turn to discussions among researchers about which places will be livable under changing climate conditions. This discussion is often framed in terms of habitability. Historically, habitability was intertwined with colonialism, delineating which places were habitable for whom. Many have recently discussed the need for habitability to move beyond simple notions of environmental determinism, to grapple with social ecological systems. But some have proposed that the human climate niche is shifting, and that as regions with optimal temperatures shift, there will be a growing mismatch between population growth and favorable climate conditions. Building on this, others argue that migration will be a necessary response. Yet others argue that climate conditions impact migration in complex ways, and therefore there is no human climate niche. Rapid onset shocks can increase or decrease migration, and for long-term stressors, we still can't predict what the future dynamics will be. So as Daou and Selby say, there's no universal climatically determined envelope in which humans can live and thrive. Suggesting that there is has a tendency to fuel anti-immigrant rhetoric and politics. Livability, which is a prominent concept in urban theory and practice, has been notably absent from these discussions. In contrast to habitability, livability has always intersected with natural and environmental systems and social, physical, and built systems. According to Paul and Sen, livability refers to the ability to dwell in certain physical spaces with appropriate cultural and environmental preparedness. Climate factors such as temperature, precipitation, and drought tend to affect livability, but governance can ameliorate those impacts. At the same time, ranking cities by livability has been a prominent and problematic practice, contributing to competition between cities and ignoring the well-being of marginalized populations. Livability assessments could be more progressive, and some have tackled this challenge. Livability is often linked with sustainability. It can span a host of qualities, from urban greening to equal access to services, to walkability, to participatory decision-making. In other words, it entails good urbanism and good governance. So synthesizing this, We agree with the many scholars here who have been advancing the understanding that habitability is not environmentally determined. Rather, it is socially constructed. And the concept that more robustly engages with interacting natural and social systems is urban livability. So we take that as our point of departure. And now, appreciating the social nature of livability, we sought to operationalize the framework of effective receiving communities. We focused on the Frost Belt as an imagined receiving zone. We included states in the upper Midwest, Great Lakes, and Northeast, but excluded coastal metro areas. For socioeconomic conditions, we focused on housing, employment, and access to non-car transportation, all key elements of livability. To understand adaptation capacity, we used a combination of quantitative and qualitative data. On the quantitative side, we included the size of FEMA hazard mitigation planning grants. On the qualitative side, we evaluated adaptation plans for the primary cities in each of the metro areas for cross-sector collaboration, equity and justice, and implementation. We also included participation in climate networks, such as climate mayors and ICLEI. Integration capacity was the most challenging to measure. We settled on participation in bridge-building networks, such as All In and Bridge the Divide. Finally, to understand which places are actually receiving newcomers, our measure of migration was the balance of people moving in and out, or net migration, both domestic and international, from 2016 to 2020. In our regression analysis, we found positive net migration correlated with two main factors: affluent urban places and car-dependent places. So we're seeing positive net migration into places with larger populations that are more expensive, where people are earning more money. These include metro areas with large cities like Chicago and Minneapolis at the core, and other metros with smaller cities like Manchester, New Hampshire, and Worcester, Massachusetts. Unsurprisingly, people are moving to places where there are more jobs. So maybe receiving communities are actually big growing cities, not small depopulating Rust Belt cities. Independently, we're seeing positive net migration into car-dependent places. This is also unsurprising. For some time now, the so-called return to the city has been reversing, partly because suburban places have more affordable housing. Notably, given our interests here, this migration trend may also be exacerbating climate change. When we look at migration alone, we see that some places in this region do have positive net migration, but most of the metro areas still have negative net migration. Clearly, the Frost Belt is not a mass receiving region. But returning to the question of which places have the capacity to be receiving communities, you could argue that, one, the affluent urban places that are receiving newcomers have capacity because they have jobs, but they are also more expensive, raising questions about equity. Who are these receiving communities for? But two, you could adopt an availability argument that ongoing population loss positions many of these places to receive people. But even if these metro areas have housing or jobs, that ignores the important question of whether these places are adapting to climate change. So we looked at the relationship between net migration and adaptation plan quality. We did not find a statistically significant relationship there, but we looked at how those qualities intersect to describe varieties of receiving communities across this imagined receiving region. We see there are relatively few metro areas with high plan quality that are gaining population. These seem to be actual receiving communities. They are receiving people because they have housing and jobs, and they're adapting. Some of the major cities in these metro areas, such as Cincinnati and Minneapolis, have attracted climate haven hype. But State College, Pennsylvania, and St. Cloud, Minnesota also come into this category, and there hasn't been a word about them. We also find relatively few places with high plan quality that are losing population. These are plausible receiving communities because they're adapting. However, they are not attracting population, so they're most likely lacking in the necessary housing and jobs. Some of the cities in these regions have also been called climate havens: Duluth, Ann Arbor, and Rochester. But Richmond, Indiana, and La Crosse, Wisconsin also fall into this category and haven't received a mention. Next, we see that metro areas with in-migration and low plan quality outnumber both of the groups with high plan quality. These also could be considered receiving communities because they are attracting people. However, they fall short on their adaptation planning. Some of the cities in these metro areas have also been called out as likely climate havens: Burlington, Vermont, and Madison, Wisconsin. Finally, the vast majority of metro areas are losing population and have low plan quality. These places are far from being receiving communities. They lack the qualities that would draw people there, and they lack the planning to adapt to climate change. Some of the cities that have been hyped in the media also fall into this category. So within the Frost Belt, an imagined receiving region, we see varieties of receiving communities. But we also see a majority of metro areas that have both negative net migration and weak adaptation planning, which cannot plausibly be understood as receiving communities. So the upshot is there is a huge discrepancy between the hype around the Frost Belt and, one, current levels of positive net migration, and two, preparedness to receive people under worsening climate conditions. So as we proceed to think about and plan for receiving communities, let's be very careful about which places we identify and why. We should clearly reject vague allusions to the favorable climate of this region and instead attend to the real socioeconomic conditions and adaptation capacity that could actually make these livable places. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Damla Kuru, joining us from the University of Utah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Let's see if this, okay, wait. Uh-oh. We should go backwards. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Damla Kuru. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at University of Utah, and today I'll be talking about our research with my co-authors from University of Massachusetts Amherst that is exploring COVID-era migrations and specifically looking at receiving communities in rural Northeast. And we know that environmental shocks, such as hurricanes or stresses, are drivers of migration, and they have been displacing hundreds of millions of people across the world, including Americans. And these numbers are projected to rise only. And moving on to receiving communities, Northeast region is often identified as, mentioned as a potential climate destination, as Hannah mentioned, actually. And looking closer to the region, we see that sea level rise-driven migration, sea level rise is expected to drive populations towards inland Northeast and more rural areas from bigger cities. It is the projection. And we see a similar trend from COVID. We see that, expect that these rural areas have been receiving population during and after COVID from bigger cities. So these could be perceived as opportunity for smaller communities for their sustainable growth. And also these could pose a lot of challenges for those communities. And proactive planning could help with these. So within these in mind, being concerned with these problems, we wanted to sort of take a picture of what has been going on during COVID era and try to understand what lessons we can learn for receiving communities that could be affected by climate migration. So our research questions, specific research questions, were if climate migration is really happening in Northeast region, and what outcomes we can expect from climate migration based on what we have been seeing in receiving communities during COVID. And we analyzed population trends in 7 Northeast states, including Connecticut, Maine, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New Hampshire, New York, Vermont. And our data, our specific data came from statistics of income data by IRS, which basically gave us the numbers of tax returns, numbers of tax returns that were filed in different addresses, in different counties from previous years. And we took it as a proxy of the population movements, and we used it in geospatial analysis. And then to have an in-depth understanding of what's going on in receiving communities, we conducted case studies with hotspots, meaning the communities, the 22 rural counties that have received the highest amount of relative migration during COVID years. And these hotspots, we conducted focus groups with housing experts in these hotspots, and our sample included major real estate brokers or housing officials in those areas. And our results revealed that there was a noticeable exodus from densely urbanized areas such as New York and Massachusetts, like the states that included metro areas, actually, I should have said. And there was a notable influx in predominantly rural states such as Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont. Those states were receiving migration during COVID. And there was also a greater gain in rural interior counties. Our county level data just revealed that there was a greater gain in rural interior counties as well as mid-coast Maine in 2020. And when we compared these with pre-COVID migration trends, we saw that the overall patterns were similar, but the numbers increased. And moving on to receiving communities, we found out that the newcomers in the top receiving communities were majorly coming from elsewhere in Northeast. And again, controlling for pre-COVID migration trends, the densely populated counties such as New York County, New York, where Manhattan is, or Middlesex, Massachusetts, for instance, were losing highest number of populations during COVID. So our case study findings supported that majority of the newcomers were coming from within the region, coming from bigger cities within the region. And there were some newcomers reported that, our participants reported that there were some newcomers from climate-impacted areas such as Florida, California, Colorado, and for example, the quote we see on the right-hand side is reporting some of them, one of them. But the numbers were these climate-induced migrants, the percentage was really low compared to the overall migration. And some of the participants called this movement as a slow reverse snowbird effect, which drove populations from heat-impacted communities towards cooler areas. And they expected this to increasingly continue, but again, in the time of our study, climate was not a major driver of migration. So then what were the drivers of these migrations? So push factors that pushed people from the cities included socioeconomic challenges faced in urban areas such as high cost of living, high cost of housing in general, and lifestyle and remote work changes accelerated during COVID era, as we all know. And pull factors that attracted populations towards rural Northeast, though, was housing affordability and some employment opportunities, especially in Western Massachusetts area, and natural amenities, social infrastructures, such as quality of education in some areas, or familial and friendship ties were reported by our participants. But these movements came with a lot of challenges as well. Let's see, okay. For example, our experts reported that their already limited housing stock was not able to keep up with the higher demand, which spiked up the housing prices. Locals who were typically financing for buying a house could not compete with the newcomers who were coming with cash and buying cash. And there was a limited construction that was reported a lot in the area due to strict building codes or lack of construction labor in general in those smaller communities. And rental market was already tight, but got crunched due to seasonal houses and short-term rentals. And similarly, physical infrastructure and social services were overburdened during that time. And our discussions were taking place actually right after the flood severely impacted some of the communities in Northeast in July 2023. And almost everybody was talking about their communities were not ready, were not built to receive migrants. And even to deal with their current population in a resilient way. So low-income groups, moving on to socioeconomic challenges, we saw disproportionate impacts on low-income groups who already had less resources and less adaptive capacity to these changes. And they were facing displacement, gentrification, increasing homelessness, and even in some cases, they end up the most vulnerable places, which happen to be the most affordable places. And finally, in conclusion, we can say that climate is not yet one of the major drivers of migration in Northeast. In the wake of COVID, migrants were largely motivated by socioeconomic factors and lifestyle changes during COVID. But these findings alert us about some challenges can be faced in receiving communities. And Northeast can potentially be a quote-unquote safer climate destination in case it's planned ahead, and regional planning should actually include, should focus on improving existing housing and infrastructure capacity, as well as climate resilience. And regional planning agenda needs to integrate pulse and slower migration trends on their agenda, and integration of newcomers and existing population politically, culturally is going to be very important in that case. And perhaps most importantly, regional planning needs to be carried out with the communities, each of which may have very different priorities in general. So, closing up, I would like to also mention some limitations of our research. Like, we focused on COVID-era migration, so our findings were COVID-related, COVID-dominated, I would say, and some further research in another time probably would reveal some other findings. And also we were exploring mainly inter-regional migration as climate migration, but further studies can look at intra-regional within the region migration to find out some further findings. And thank you.
Damla, thank you so much. Mixed methods, interregional, so much to offer. Finally, our last speaker, before we jump to a panel and to hear from you all in terms of questions and the like, is Macey Williams, Resilience Manager for the Center for Planning Excellence from the great state of Louisiana. Thank you for joining us.
Hi. Okay, I know it's been a long day. I'm going to make this relatively quick. Macey Williams, Resilience Manager at the Center for Planning Excellence. And I'm here today, well, first let me just say thank you to the organizers. Thank you guys for creating such a great foundation for this discussion. I feel truly honored to be one of the few representing Louisiana's perspective in this regard. So, is it the green button? All right, so before we start, I thought it'd be fun to play a little game, nothing crazy. It's just a true or false. As we run through these statements, I want you to ask yourself, is this true or is this false? Figure out where you lean, and we'll have a takeaway before we move forward. So number one, Louisiana is losing a football field's worth of land with every 100 minutes. True. Louisiana's population has remained approximately the same since 2020. Also true. Well, and in the next 25 years, Louisiana is projected to lose another 2,500 more square miles of land, which is equivalent to the state of Delaware. Fun fact. True or false? True. So what does this tell us? We have the same amount of people on less land. Let's table that for a second. We'll move on to slightly more boring information. So the Center for Planning Excellence, also known as CPEX, we are a planning and policy nonprofit that serves the entire state of Louisiana. And what I'd say our work boils down to is this sentence here. We champion the power of planning to build livable, resilient communities throughout Louisiana through our work as policy advocates, educators, and planning experts. Something that isn't mentioned here and I think is really important is I think we're really good at connecting people. That will also come up in a moment. We were established in 2006. And since then, we've worked with many communities across the state, largely consolidated in the coastal area, as you can see. And here, the map illustrates just different parishes, which are counties. And yeah, so different parishes or communities that we've worked in, either through providing technical assistance or supporting a comprehensive master planning effort. And then, of course, we work at the state level, so that would like kind of cover the entire state. But that's not fun to put on there. Oh, before we jump into this, I do want to say our resilience is such a buzzword now, and I want to clarify kind of how we approach that concept. We see resilience as not just bouncing back to what was before, but making sure the people and the communities are able to come back from a disaster or a disturbance and thrive, more so than they were beforehand. We think that is true resilience. So, what does our work look like in the context of environmental migration? And I'd say this also boils down to this one sentence. Approximately the same amount of land, the same amount of people on less land, all hoping that their homes, their livelihoods, and their families can withstand another hurricane season. I know, it sounds a bit dramatic, but it's not. It's the reality. And when this sentence specifically isn't the reality then looks like ceaseless worry. So the next hurricane season comes. Okay, oh my God, we survived this one. What's gonna happen with the next one? What's our evacuation strategy? What are we gonna do? What's gonna happen with our home? Is our insurance up to date? There are so many considerations in this nexus of living here, as I'm sure many of you understand. This also looks like disappointment in your local leaders and decision makers whenever they are not advocating for the interventions necessary to be able to keep your family there, or your livelihood, or your business, whatever asset you've been pouring your energy and money into. here you'll see a map of Southeast Louisiana migration patterns. This is something that CPEX developed with the state agencies during a project called LA Safe. And for those that aren't super familiar with Louisiana, I went ahead and just pointed out New Orleans for you in case you had a off chance of partying there. Yeah, so you'll see here patterns that are consistent with recent climate migration research, which basically is that different from traditional and historical migration patterns, people are only moving 1 or 2 towns up, because a lot of this is actually built on social capital. And then you have a lot of other capital into play, but social capital is a huge, huge driver for where people decide to settle temporarily or permanently in the face of disaster. So this map here just exemplifies that. And I was gonna say something else. What was I gonna, oh. Little fun fact for Louisiana, we typically call this up the bayou. People are just moving up the bayou, quite literally. And so as you can see here with the proliferation of the coastline, when people are only moving up the bayou, they're safe for 10, 15, maybe 20 years if they're lucky, if intervention happens sporadically. But that's not what we've been seeing. So before we move forward, I just want to say that we all know this. Each move results in a loss of capital, both financial and social. There's a loss of identity, loss of place, loss of connection, loss of money, loss of assets, lots of loss. So, strategic intervention is necessary to change the trajectory of this. And it's clear, decision makers are missing key information. We're about to go into a case study that pertains to the information that we know and how this is going to impact key population centers. Before I go into that, I wanted to just say that the research body hits really hard on receiving communities, but what is lacking is a clear understanding of what receivership in these communities will look like and how it will impact our infrastructural systems. And you gave such a great presentation relating to that. Unfortunately, though, this information is next to nothing for Louisiana. And so my goal was to help bridge this gap. So what we know is that due to sea level rise and natural disasters alone, 1.2 million people are projected to move away from coastal Louisiana by 2050. This is 25% of Louisiana's population today. Just let's let that sink in for a second. What we also know, the largest portion of this group is projected to migrate to East Baton Rouge Parish. Okay, so this is where my research comes in. I thought, okay, if this is what research is showing, what is the most recently published long-term planning document related to infrastructure that's out there for East Baton Rouge Parish? And that happened to be the East Baton Rouge Parish Stormwater Master Plan and its associated capital improvements plan. For those that aren't planners, this will direct investments until 2043. So, as you guys can probably anticipate here, my research findings show that climate change-based precipitation and human migration patterns are not considered whenever in this plan and the projects that are outlined to be prioritized in the next 20 years. So what does that mean? Lots of things, lots and lots of things. But really, I'll just say, why does this matter? So East Baton Rouge specifically has struggled on multiple occasions to even abide by the Clean Water Act, resulting in multiple instances of legal action. That's crazy. It's crazy to me. And then what this also looks like, with increased runoff and increased demand on this obviously antiquated system, this will likely, more than likely, result in increased flooding, result in increased damages of assets and infrastructure, and will obviously incur substantial costs. Another thing here to note is that there's a higher potential for contamination and general public health risk. So all of these things are coming together. Nearly done. Resilience made possible by collaboration, blah, 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 blah. We all know this, right? Break down the sectors, break the silos. There's so much out there that talks about this, but today I want to remind you of what this could look like and what this has looked like in successfully proven, in successful initiatives that do this. And so recognizing and leaning into the arena of decision-making and governance can lead to long-term data-informed change. And what I want to say here is that what I really think is at the heart of this is bridging the science and policy gap. What I would also say here is that I wish I could prescribe a specific formula for each of you in each of the communities that you represent, work in, reside within. But unfortunately, the power that lies within the systems, different governing bodies, and the research that you have to offer create a very nuanced and locally specific formula here. But I'll give you a few examples of people that are, I think, effectively doing this. So the first, it's not listed here, but the Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative. This is where they're taking proven leaders to essentially become a think tank in order to address some of the major challenges we're facing today. Another one, which I have exemplified in this picture, is the Tulane Bywater Institute. This is a picture from one of their coastal workshops. And I mention them because it's a local institution, local academic institution that has created this entity with the goal of engaging the public and local decision makers on water-related issues. I think that's pretty cool. That's an example of academia. And then what I'll say here too is that CPEX is actively working to get a partnership in place for Loyola, another academic institution in the area, with the Louisiana Public Service Commission in order to have a fellow to better understand how research and policy can be enacted in this framework of power. Because the LPSC, I'm sure as many of you are not familiar with, is a highly powerful energy regulating body not in the United States, in Louisiana. So, my takeaway here is that adaptive planning practices, policy design, funding streams, and education are all a necessity as climate change impacts worsen. And as researchers, educators, practitioners, I see all of us as being essential parts of this puzzle. And I hope that you feel empowered to realize where you are within these systems, to recognize what you bring to the table, and to go to those that are making big decisions and learning what is needed in order to bridge this gap, because that is truly how we're going to get from point A to point B. And here on the map, I just included a projection by CPRA 30 years out, so in the mid-2050s, of the damages that are to come, the cost of the damages that are to come, should intervention not be had, should strategic, best practice, resilient planning not be had. For context, the lighter purple is $0 to $1 million. The darkest purple is above $1 billion. So there's a lot to lose here. I look forward to your questions, and if you want to learn more about CPEX, go to cpex.org, and there are also a ton of open source resources available for all of you. Thanks.
So I invite all our panelists, speakers. speakers slash panelists to join us up here and immediately open it up to you all in the final minutes that we have. There has to be some burning questions or comments. I can feel it. These guys, while you guys think about it, and there's microphones right here, actually. Question. Come on down, we've got microphones, but I'll meet you halfway with this one. I can just project. Well, I think for the people online, for their benefit.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Sydney Fishman. I'm with Washington Sea Grant. And my question specifically is directed at the studies about potential receiving communities in the Frost Belt and in the Northeast, but open it up to others as well. I'm wondering if you could, I don't know if this is speculation into the future or not, but talk about how you envision the results that you have. Do you think the results that you received in your studies might change in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? I guess what I'm thinking about is, Hannah, for example, you found that there are places that are losing population, but maybe in 10 years, 15 years, those trends might swing. What do you think about that speculation, and how might we know? Are there things that we can look out for? I guess I'm just thinking into the future about how, if and when these trends might reverse.
Yeah, I think that we can definitely.
See if your mic is on, if you could. Just pull it forward.
Is it on? Yeah, okay. I think we can definitely expect them to change. I guess it's hard to say exactly how, but I mean, the main purpose of this study was to try to, push back against the hype and understand that there's a wide variety of receiving regions. I think that, it will change in ways that we do want and that we don't want. And it's like, if there's good planning and if there's economic development, maybe some of these places that have already planned for adaptation could receive more people. If we don't do that planning, then people are more likely to move to places that have jobs that don't necessarily have planning. So I think in a way, it's kind of all up for grabs, and it's just kind of laying it out so that we have an understanding of the foundation from which we might begin more intentional planning.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that because I was surprised to see State College there, and it made me think one of the drivers for where people move is concentrations of higher education, which would also make those places have more adaptive capacity or have more planners, frankly, people who write plans. I don't know that planning capacity is like a limiting factor for growth. I think what I've seen, and I don't know if this bears out in the research, but a willingness to accept newcomers is probably a bigger factor. And I feel like college towns have experience accepting newcomers, and maybe other places do too. Some, like, places with, like poultry farming communities in Arkansas have capacity accepting newcomers or experience, but maybe not in the same way that college towns do, where they can also build adaptive capacity and build economic development opportunities while accepting newcomers. So I feel like if we wanted to make the Frost Belt a good place for people fleeing climate events, we would just build more schools.
Okay, yeah, that's an interesting point. Like I mentioned, we did struggle to measure that integration capacity. We knew it was an important factor, but we looked at integration plans, and there were so few of them that it just wasn't very meaningful to evaluate them, and so that's why we just looked at participation in the bridge building networks. But I mean, I think looking at places with institutions of higher education could be an interesting proxy, and there are probably other ways that we could think about that. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a great idea to say, well, we should go build more universities in more of these places to attract people, but I think there's definitely something there to the integration capacity.
Can you explain to everybody about the bridge participation just real quick? I'm not sure everybody caught that.
Oh, yeah, so there are a bunch of networks that started really after the 2016 election that we're trying to work on bridging ideological divides. So like All In and Bridge the Divide, there are a number of them around the country. And so we just looked at which places were participating in those networks. And that was the way we measured integration capacity.
Please, thank you.
Hi. So I have a couple of questions, but in the interest of time, I will narrow it down. I think from all your perspectives, the first speaker sort of gave us a glance at what the federal level, especially like policies and pushback policies are, how they are relating to climate migration. With this excitement of the Frost Belt, could you share a bit about what that has looked like at the federal level, like their interest in that, their willingness to fund more development projects, et cetera, in that area? Or has that been something that the states are kind of asking themselves to handle, their potential capacity as a receiving community, or this excitement about them being receiving communities? Is that something the federal government has pumped resources into to sort of live up to that expectation, or has there been a gap? And also in your research, and I think across the board, we've talked about integration, and wondering, just as you've spoken about immigration, and there's a lot of immigrant groups that are pushing, have fought these pushback policies as well as have advocated for new policies. We see that with TPS, temporary protected status, that is not a policy that welcomes people, but rather keeps people where they are. And is being attacked again, and so we could have something kind of like a delayed climate displacement consequence, where they were displaced by climate a while ago and were kind of in limbo, and now they're undocumented because they had status and then did not. So we're kind of delayed in the impact in a way. How have you integrated or had communications with immigrant rights groups who were seeing the effects of welcoming versus the reduction of resources that help with integrating newer folks into societies?
Hey, maybe?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, so for those who don't know, TPS is a designation that the United States government can make at the federal level, and it basically means that someone from a country that has a TPS designation, which typically has to be requested by the leader of the other country, that person can have temporary protection status in the United States for, I think, a duration of 2 years for each designation. But they already have to be in the United States at the time the designation is made. So if you, I don't know, came to the US a year ago or 30 days ago for vacation or something, and then your home country experienced a hurricane and the United States gave TPS to your home country, then you could stay, but you can't come with TPS. So it's a very limited form of protected status. And your point about it being kind of a trap, because you can stay in the United States, but you can't come back if you leave at that point without advance permission, is totally well taken. And I personally have not had conversations with immigrant rights groups about this this question, but that's really interesting one, something I'm definitely interested in looking more into. I think it is absolutely a point of contention, though, for like integration into cities, societies, towns, rural areas, basically across the U.S. and beyond. These designations, and I think there does need to be more concerted resource planning at the federal level, but also at state and city levels for that integration. I will just say that at the federal level, the United States released the first White House climate migration plan, something along those lines, in 2021 under Biden. In reading through it myself, I didn't do a systematic analysis, but it didn't seem like there was much in the way of designating any kind of funding or resources toward integration, merely the mention that that might be important. So I haven't seen anything like that myself, but.
The answer is no. The federal government has had really zero interest or ambition, and it's really actually been the states, if anything, that have had some peripheral ambition but no real resources. The report that you cite, which Alex DeSherban played a major role in shaping, actually what we found from that body of work was amping up an intelligence system to anticipate the human movements of people in more emergency circumstances. So it was really doubling down on intelligence, not so much any legal protective status. So you've framed the right questions, but we unfortunately have zero answers in a positive sense, or a productive sense, I would say. Please.
Thank you. Thank you to the panel for your excellent presentations. I think my question could be answered by anyone, and I pose it to all of you. But I think what was interesting in just comparing, I guess, what Hannah presented versus what Omar presented, I think the question that always comes to my mind is also the fact that receiving communities could be dealing with population change that is happening over multiple scales and multiple time frames. And, you know, there's, using the COVID example as a proxy, that's really considering almost, a rapid onset event or a crisis situation where influx is quite quick. And, we know that the speed and size of population change really matters from the planning perspective. So my question is just broadly, what do you think, how best can we prepare receiving communities to grapple with that question, to hold that in their planning considerations so that they're holding multiple scales of movement and multiple time frames of movement, at the forefront when making these considerations? Because there's, of course, multiple trade-offs. That's a really big question, but.
No, I think it's a really important one, and I'll jump in myself with this quick brief, and I'm superseding, using my editorial privilege here. I think that there's really, I think you bring up a great point. There's really no way to get a sense of scale for purposes of capital planning, and I'm glad that Macey brought up capital planning because we could bring a lot of this back to that. I think what we see and what I would anticipate that we would see from a planning conventions is an internal audience, and the idea that building capacity, you may project that externally for climate migrants, but ultimately you're building for the people who are there in your kind of known realm of constituencies. And it may have the collateral benefit or the underlying flexibility to accommodate, but I think you nail a really fundamental challenge. And I'd love to hear from you all, particularly interregional, Damla, but also Hannah on that point, and maybe really everybody, and I'm sorry for using up your time, but it's a difficult and central challenge empirically.
Yeah, I would agree. And also I would say, I don't know, yeah. I would say there is no one size fits for all solution for any communities. Like even in Northeast, like all the communities are different than each other in terms of like welcoming migrants. Like some are more open to newcomers, whereas others like are lobbying against like, any kind of migration in general. So I would say like starting this conversation in planning, like, trying to sort of integrate kind of these, pulse versus like slow onset movements into conversation and trying to build up some trust with communities is the key, can be a starting point for planning actually, because you cannot build trust overnight. So it's just very, very key to, communicating with communities, receiving communities in general. So I would say like this could be at least something to start with.
I think another important point is that as we're thinking about receiving communities, that the adaptation piece is always just as essential as the integration piece, and that this is a moment when we maybe need to be entirely rethinking infrastructure planning. So I read a recent paper on modular, adaptive, decentralized water systems, and I think that that's something we should start to really take seriously, and that's something that could potentially be more flexible in responding to these kinds of very uncertain population changes.
But let me tell you about that, though, because this has come up a lot in practice. And the problem with that, and I agree, I immediately zoomed in. I was like, oh, man, the capacity for water quality, the whole thing, there's so much here. Energy efficiency, there's a lot there. But the problem with a lot of the decentralized systems is you're taking away from the scaled efficiencies and the revenue side of scaled operators that can work at more effectively and efficiently in many ways. And you're also opening up into areas of environmental degradation, because they make the argument that we don't need to follow the conventional spatial pathways of centralized infrastructure, that we can use a decentralized form of infrastructure. And Macey brought up the stormwater, and that was such a great point, because a lot of times it's transportation or it's water or wastewater that becomes a deterministic driver of where spatial planning graphs onto. And I'm really concerned that the decentralized aspects of that infrastructure allow us to move into exurban and peri-urban in ways that actually leads to, not in absolute terms, and I hear what you're saying, but there's two sides to that coin.
Yeah, but decentralized can happen in a dense environment.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I'd like to add to the conversation here, because I think it's a very great question. And coming from my experience, my understanding of how all of this works in Louisiana, having political support, having continuity between administrations, forget the federal level, forget it. Get down to the state, regional, and local level, because truly, that is where we can make change, and we can make it in a much more timely manner, which is what we know is needed. So I loved, I just want to add that, because I think that's a very tangible thing that not a lot of people are recognizing to be pertinent. And maybe it's not pertinent everywhere, but I know for damn sure it is in Louisiana.
Yeah, thanks folks for the awesome talk. I apologize, I was just a touch late, so hopefully this doesn't cover something that already came up. I really appreciated the words that you shared related to the impacts on receiving communities, because whether it's formally designated one or not, I definitely live in one. It's an awesome place, can't blame people for wanting to live there. But it's interesting to watch this community that has been aware of the need to adapt to a growing population for the last 20 years and has kind of slowly made movements to meet those needs, and is now really critically seeing the impact of not making those adaptive moves sooner. So I'm curious from your experience and research whether you've seen communities find ways to creatively accelerate their adaptive potential in light of these pressures.
Well, first, like in the communities that we talked to, I think I would say it was like very sudden movements for those communities after COVID. So they were like shocked by all this influx. So there weren't like, there weren't like the solutions, like, policies that could address those changes. But I would say like the communities, especially in like, these are the communities that I'm more familiar with in Western Massachusetts. So I would say like those communities who are already doing like climate adaptation policies in place in general are at least one step further than the others, I would say. But again, like with the migration, it's a whole another topic. So they, again, were struggling with all these, especially about housing-related challenges, I would say.
We've run over time, but if we could grab our one last question, and we'll be brief and respectful of your time, so thank you all, but please, one last question and then we'll adjourn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to say that this question will probably be brief because part of it has already been answered. I greatly enjoyed all of your talks, and for myself, I'm someone with a background in both planning and water and wastewater engineering, and we started talking about how water and wastewater infrastructure systems will also have to change and adapt for receiving communities. And I'm curious to know what y'all think young plant engineers such as myself should really start focusing on with the new climate paradigm.
I'll take this one first, maybe. I got to work on a lot of like water management planning, both at the stormwater level, coastal level, riverine level, for resilience and adaptation building. And I think the first thing, there's a lot to think about for sure, but the first thing I would say is like in any infrastructure that you're queuing up, that you're building, that you're funding, there absolutely needs to be a climate consideration. And Mace brought up that that doesn't always mean that the models are accommodating future projections or potential dynamic future projections or an increase in capacity for the number of people. So for instance, like one of the big criticisms of FEMA for a long time, and I think still, is that the models that FEMA is using to develop the flood maps are not future considering. It's not considering a dynamic system of future hurricanes, storms, potential rain events. So that's what I would say is like, consider that now, because when you do build out that infrastructure for 2043, you don't want it to be 30 years behind.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists, or speakers, I should say, and thank you to you all for joining us here late this evening. So please, thank you very much.